You are listening to the Wool Academy podcast. This is episode number 76.
Hello and welcome. My name is Elisabeth van Delden, and once a week we talk to an industry expert from the wool industry supply chain from farm to fashion and beyond, delivering strategies and insights to be successful in wool and showcasing those beautiful stories wool has to tell.
Wiedemann is an agricultural systems scientist and principal at Integrity Ag Services in Australia. Stephen is an expert on livestock production and supply chains, resource management, sustainability, and environmental regulations. Stephen will talk to us today about his work on sheep and wool-related life cycle assessment projects. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Well, I gave a little bit of an introduction, but why don't you also introduce yourself and tell us about the work that you do?
Okay, that was a great introduction. Thank you. My work, as you mentioned, is largely in the area of agriculture and the environment. I am a researcher, but I also consult to industry in a range of associated areas. So a lot of our work is for the wool industry, both at farm and processing level and right through the supply chain. But we also work more broadly in agriculture and particularly in animal agriculture, in lifecycle assessment and environmental assessment more broadly as well.
And you work at Integrity Ag Services. What does Integrity Ag Services do?
We conduct agricultural and environmental research. We do extension or training and education for industry members, mainly in the area of the environment and planning and regulations associated with that. We also help private companies do development applications and environmental monitoring.
As many people in the wool industry, you also have another hat on. You are currently the head of the IWTO LCA Technical Advisory Group. So please introduce the group and what it is set out to achieve.
Absolutely. The Technical Working Group is an advisory group to the Sustainable Practices Working Group. So that is addressing all issues in the industry relating to sustainable practice. But in more particular terms, our working group looks at supply chain impacts assessed with life cycle assessment.
Yeah, so you already mentioned life cycle assessment, and in short, it's LCA. Can you briefly explain what an LCA exactly is for those who are not so familiar with the term?
Sure. Life cycle assessment is a tool for measuring the environmental impacts and resource use of a product or a service. So essentially, you can do life cycle assessment research on any type of product you can think of, but also services as well. In the case of the wool industry, our focus is, for example, on a woolen garment, but you could also consider the service that garment provides. So maybe it's fashion, but it's also warmth. So it's to be worn. And it looks at all the impacts throughout the whole, supply chain for that product. So that would involve, for a woolen garment, everything to do with manufacturing that garment, processing and spinning the wool, making it up into a garment, but also right back to producing the wool, which is done on farms in different parts of the world. And then all the input as well that are required to do that. So, for example, energy is required in many stages in that supply chain. So we take into account all the impacts of producing that energy right back to, let's say, extracting oil out of the ground or coal or nuclear or whatever the power source is behind all that. So it's very comprehensive to produce a woolen garment. In an LCA study, we may look at maybe 25,000 or more processes that go into making that product.
Wow, I didn't know that it involved that much of different data points. Okay, that's really interesting. And why is it important for the wool industry to actually be doing research on life cycle assessment?
Well, I can think of two broad reasons. There's many reasons, but if I condense it, one is to inform consumers and brands and even governments regarding the impacts of the industry and of the products that the industry produces. There's widespread interest nowadays in sustainable production. So this is one way that you can inform people, hopefully in a way that's understandable to them, of the impacts of the products that they use. The second is from an industry point of view, it's very helpful for improving your own performance, for reducing environmental impacts, because you can identify all the main parts of the supply chain where those impacts occur, and you can help develop strategies for how to reduce those impacts.
Yeah, and so for the wool industry is doing a lot of work in LCA, and you will talk about it as well as we go along in our conversation. But do other textile fibers also do research in this area?
Yeah, they certainly do. The cotton industry has also been very active in this area and have done a number of studies, both in individual countries but also globally now. So they've invested quite heavily to understand their impacts. Probably less so in the synthetic fibres type area. There's certainly some information there, but if you just do a search of published papers or even industry reports, there's less work there. So most industries there is at least some information, but I'd say the natural fibres have invested more in this area.
Okay, now let's talk a little bit about what you have been working on. So explain to us I understand that because life cycle assessment is so complex that the working group has split it into different areas. So what have been the topics you have been researching on lately?
You're right to say we've sort of separated different areas and focused on them separately. So a couple of years ago, we finished, I guess, the most comprehensive work that had been done to date at the farm stage, so the production of greasy wool from sheep. And so that area is reasonably well understood now. There's always more we could learn, but we've got at least some studies in that area now. More recently, we've been working on the processing sector and also the use stage, so what consumers are doing with woolen garments. So they've been two of our big recent areas. We've also been looking at wool recycling, because wool is a popular product for recycling also. So they've been the main areas. We've been doing some other work on broadening out the number of impacts that are assessed. I didn't mention earlier, but one feature of life cycle assessment is that it doesn't just look at a single impact, whereas, say, carbon footprinting is focused on greenhouse gas emissions. LCA would look at greenhouse gas, but also energy, perhaps water, and then a range of other impacts can be included. Eutrophication, which is impacts to water quality, toxicity, which is impacts to water quality and also potentially human health. And look, there's quite a lengthy list, but our focus has been building up around the areas where we know impacts are a problem.
And did I understand that you also looked at the wool processing stage?
Yeah, absolutely. We've just completed the most comprehensive work that's been done by the industry to date with a number of major wool processing or woolen mills, mainly in the big production areas, China and India, also some in Europe. So that's been really good to see that work progressed.
So what have been the findings from your research on the wool processing stage?
Our work in the wool processing stage is, I guess, largely you'd describe it as a fact-finding exercise. There wasn't a lot of information or data available prior to this study. So we found that processing is an important area for energy use and also for chemical use associated with dyeing, etc. And also water use. But we found some encouraging trends in all of that work. First, that energy use is lower than what has previously been understood, and that there are some processors who are looking at renewable energy sources to reduce energy use. Also, a trend towards lower chemical use, and also the use of less harmful dyes, which is a good development in the industry. And lastly, around water use as well, we've found a number of facilities that are using recycling for their water to reduce water demands, and also treating that water so that it can be released back to the source that it was withdrawn from, again to reduce the impact of water abstractions.
And would the goal be to then repeat the measurements for the LCA again and again to see also progress?
Yeah, look, that is one thing that we are considering at the moment is and aiming to continue to provide that sort of information. We want to demonstrate that the industry is proactive, that it's not just about finding a number that is everything you need to know. The industry is always changing. There's new practices being brought in all the time that improve efficiency, and so yes, repeating that work, demonstrating those changes and those positive trends is an important aspect of the TAGS work program.
Okay, so we will revisit your findings in a few years again on the show, probably. So, So you also mentioned earlier that you've been also doing or focusing on the use phase and the reuse phase of wool products. Can you tell us a little bit more what you found out in this area?
Yeah, this is very important. The use phase is very influential. The way garments are used potentially has the largest impact at any stage in the supply chain. And there are a few reasons for that I think are really important for any of our listeners who are users of wool garments or consumers to understand. And the first is this. In the use phase, the owner or user of a garment really determines how long that garment remains in service or in use. So, for example, if you choose to keep a garment for, let's say, 6 years and really care for it rather than 3 years, then you require fewer garments in your wardrobe to provide for your needs, and that requires less of the world to produce those garments. So wool is a fibre that we know is used for long periods. Our current estimates, or the best estimates we have, which come from a number of surveys that have been done of consumers, is greater than 5 years, and it varies between countries and between garments. So we understand that wool is what you'd call slow fashion, or it really suits slow fashion, high quality garments that can be used repeatedly. And this is something that we really want to highlight and encourage, because it just reduces the demand on the world, and in a environment where the fashion industry at large is heading the other direction, using garments for less and less time and then throwing them away. That just increases and increases and increases the demand for new products and all those impacts that are associated with that right through the supply chain. So that's the first area, which is very influential in the use phase. The second is around how those garments are treated. So, for example, how much they are washed, how they are washed, how they are dried as well. And for wool garments, we know some things with quite some confidence, again, from consumer surveys. We understand that wool garments are washed less than other garments, and that's because they don't need to be washed as much. They tend to resist odour, so the requirement is less, and that's a good thing. It uses less energy, it uses less water, it uses less detergents, and it allows the garment to last a bit longer too, because washing can be a process that contributes to shrink and damage of clothing in general. So that's a really good thing. And the other is wool is typically washed at lower temperatures, and the lower the water temperature, the less energy required in the washing process to heat up the water. And lastly, wool is often dried, either air dried in one form or another. It's much more common. Very few woolen garments are, let's say, tumble dried or dried using a lot of energy. So again, that's a positive for wool and reduces the impact compared to other fibre types.
So you said earlier that some garments last longer than others. So would that be typically a wool suit? People would have more years than a wool t-shirt or underwear?
Yeah, look, that is true. We do see differences between garment categories. So suits, as you mentioned, also jumpers, so outerwear garments and coats are often kept for a longer period of time and kept in use compared to maybe next to skin. So, yep, that's fair to say. But across all the garment types, we see a trend compared to other fibres where wool is kept in use for a longer period than other fibres.
So a wool t-shirt would be kept longer than a cotton t-shirt or a synthetic t-shirt?
Yeah, it does tend to be. We have more information, obviously, for the more common garment types, so suits and woolen jumpers and things like that. But yeah, we do see that trend across all garment types.
Okay, that's interesting. And people just had to tell you what they have in their closet and how long they've had it, or how did you do that research?
Yeah, there's been a number of studies done in that area. Several have been wardrobe surveys where consumers have been asked basically to go through their wardrobe, or with a researcher, they go through their wardrobe and first work out what the garments are all made of, and then specific questions are asked about how consumers use this particular garment, how long it's been in their wardrobe, how often they wash it, all of those aspects. So quite detailed research that's been done in a number of different parts of the world.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of detail, a lot of work to go through a lot of wardrobes. But now that we have a lot of more information about the wool life cycle assessment, what can these research results actually be used for?
I guess going back to the purpose of LCA work, it's very useful for the industry to understand what their own impacts are and areas that they can improve, and right down to companies and how they can improve efficiency. But there's also quite a lot of demand for this information from brands, even consumers and governments. So in Europe, there is an initiative called the Product Environmental Footprint, or PEF, which is a government initiative around understanding the impacts of products using LCA. And you also have, I guess, rating tools. So, for example, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition have a rating tool that uses an LCA approach to understand and even compare different fabric types. So one area where information is used is for connecting with those other groups that have interests in this area. But of course, we have some concerns about how that information is used as well. In LCA, one very important aspect is to talk about not just a product, but the function the product provides. So you need to really understand what can truly be compared. A wool garment that has a certain quality and style and warmth, breathability, for example, may not be comparable to some other garments, just because they have different attributes and other fibers. So look, that is one area where more work is needed, because there is a tendency or a temptation, I suppose, for some other groups to make comparisons between fibers that realistically don't provide the same function or can't be used in the same way.
So because there are these discussions going on that would long-term affect the wool industry, is that why it's so important to engage in these kind of forums, so that we have a seat at the table and decide our own destiny?
Yeah, look, I think that's really important. It's definitely the case that some brands who are making decisions around what type of fibre or fabric to use do take notice of these forums. So it's important for the industry to engage, and the industry is happy to engage as well. The industry's taken quite a principled stance in providing that information about the industry, and have invested money in doing that sort of research. So we're happy to engage, and we're also happy to, I guess, try and improve the science and improve the way all of this work is done.
But at the same time, wool is such a small niche fiber. Can we really make a difference at these forums like SAC?
Yeah, look, again, the basis for all this type of work is science. So I think the question is around the quality of the science and what is required to improve that. Oftentimes that is affecting all fibre types. It doesn't really matter what fibre type you're dealing with. They're just issues that need to be worked through and understood. So, for example, how to handle the use phase is a question, or even a problem from an understanding point of view. But as I pointed out before, it's also a huge opportunity, because being able to communicate how consumers, for example, can improve how they handle clothing will probably have the biggest impact of all. So that's a big question, not for any one particular industry, but for the world, in how to improve the sustainability of garment use. So we would hope that it can help much more broadly than just wool.
Okay. And are there any other topics or issues that are being discussed at these forums that will affect wool?
range of issues that are being discussed. The use phase that I've just mentioned is an important area, but there are other questions around what impacts are being included. For example, in LCA, the theory is that all relevant impacts should be included, but in practice that can be quite hard to achieve. Maybe there is not adequate information yet, or maybe there is not the methods, the science methods to really provide good information. The role that the industry plays there is to advocate for a level playing field. The wool industry has taken a principled position where they've been transparent about our industry and provided research, including areas which perhaps are a weakness for wool. So wool has higher greenhouse gas emissions than some other fibres, but that's a principled position, and so the industry promotes and advocates for that approach to be taken more widely. Now, in that area, we have some concerns. One, for example, is that microplastics are a large area, an important area of impact for the textiles industry more broadly, but at the moment it's not generally assessed. So one of the aspects of that, the industry wants to take a transparent and principled position, providing our research, and we want to advocate that is carried out right across the whole textiles industry.
Yeah, so that would be one area where you think there needs to be more research done. Are there other areas where you think it's important that we look at them more closely in regards to the environmental footprint of textile fibers?
Yeah, look, just to consider more broadly this microplastics issue, it's receiving a lot of attention at the moment, and for good reason. It's a really important problem for the textiles industry, and at this stage, there's a lack of information. It's a growing information base, but really there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that area to understand not just the size of the problem, but also how to fix it going forward. So that's one really important area. Look, other areas that we're investigating actively at the moment include how garments are used at the end of their life. So wool for hundreds of years has been recycled, and that's an important pathway for wool. It goes back into garments to be remade into new garments, and also into other products, so mattresses and upholstery and things like that. So we haven't got as much information as we'd like in that area. We're doing work at the moment and hope to have some published research towards the middle of the year or the second half of the year on that topic. So that's another area with a big knowledge gap that's very important for wool, but more broadly for textiles also.
Well, it sounds to me that we will have to talk again in the future, because you have still a lot of work ahead of you, and I really appreciate all what you and the IWTO Lifecycle Assessment Technical Advisory Group, very long name, has already achieved and done. And thank you so much, Stephen, for sharing all the work that you have done so far. And where can our listeners find out more if they want to read more about the research that has been done?
Yeah. Oh, firstly, you're welcome, and I'd be happy to keep you updated as we progress. Now, in the research world, sometimes things happen a little bit slower than everybody would like. So it does take quite a while to answer some of these questions, but we're working very diligently on that all the time. But to your question on where can listeners find more information, there is information on the IWTO website. We have guidelines for LCA research in the wool industry there. There are also fact sheets, and they contain links to some of the completed research studies, which are published in journals, etc. And there's also industry reports. I mentioned before recently that the work on the use phase has been published, and that's on the CIFO website. I think if you just search online for wool use phase review, that would you'd probably get there. And there's also a review on that website covering the issue of microplastics that's been recently completed as well by Dr. Beverly Henry. So there's some great resources out there, and more being generated all the time.
Excellent. And I will make sure to link to all these websites in the show notes. We also already talked to Dr. Beverly Henry around a year ago, as well as to Ingun Klepp from CIFO. So I will also make sure to link to those podcasts for anyone who's interested. Well, thank you, Stephen. I really enjoyed talking to you, and all the best for you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Elisabeth. Great to talk to you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I'm always amazed how many new things I can still learn about wool just by talking to different people in the industry, and I hope you feel the same. If you enjoyed today's interview with Stephen Wiedemann and you would like to find out more about Stephen as well as about the LCA Technical Advisory Group of the International Wool Textile Organization, then head on over to the show notes at elisabethvandelden.com/076. Once again, elisabethvandelden.com/076. Thank you for listening. Talk to you again next week, and bye for now.